Hello chess friends, I am FIDE Master Viktor Neustroev, and today we are diving deep into the basics of chess, the pawn and games. Specifically, we'll explore powerful strategies in pawn and games which will allow you to turn a seemingly simple position into a decisive win. Pawn and games seem simple, but every move may hold a huge responsibility. That's why mastering them requires accuracy and creativity. In today's video, I'll share essential techniques, demonstrate clear examples, and highlight common pitfalls. First, let's start with our first strategy, which is conversion of the pawn majority. Please take a look at this board. Imagine you have 2 pawn versus 1 on the queen side, or you have 3 versus 2. What's your winning strategy there? Here, you should create a pass pawn. So you convert your pawn majority and create a pass pawn on one side of the board. This pawn will distract the enemy king because he wants to stop your pass pawn. He doesn't want you to get promoted. And this allows you to invade the enemy camp on the other side and capture the enemy pawns there with your king. Of course, you shouldn't allow your opponent to do the same on the other side. So you shouldn't let him create a pass pawn on the other side and get your king distracted. So how to win here for white? Well, white definitely continues with a4, where their next move can be b5. Okay, so for example, black wants to do the same, g5. Let's say take, and now b5, capture. The king goes there to stop the pawn. If the king doesn't go there, then with b6 you already provoke him to go there. So let's say he goes there, and this means that your king now can join the king side and invade the enemy camp with king e5. What happens then? For example, f4, king moves closer. They trying to capture your pawns, but you are faster with your king capturing the enemy pawns, and you still have a pawn left which you can promote. Just don't forget to shoulder the enemy king and not let him occupy the g8 square. So now you can start promoting like that. Then king h7 and the pawn is promoted. That's it. So what you need to remember is, once you have a pawn majority, create a pass pawn. Don't move the pawn if it's not required. Just force the enemy king to get distracted and infiltrate the enemy camp to capture his pawns. This is how you're likely to win. Okay, so the next strategy is the pawn breakthrough. This clever strategy allows one of your pawns to sprint ahead, often dramatically changing of the game outcome. Let me show you. So, for example, this is a classic example. What do you have? 3 versus 3 on one side, and it is a draw once the pawns are blocked. For example, if you decide to play g6, they can continue with h6, and this is a draw. Maybe even they can come closer. So this king c3, king c6, king d4, king d6. So it's a draw. Fine. If they take, they may even lose the game. But how to win? In order to win, we should make a breakthrough. What does it mean? So we should create one of our pawns. We should make one of our pawns a passed pawn. How exactly? We should open the file for that pawn. For example, which file we can open? Well, there are actually several solutions for this position. Well, the g pawn can become a passed pawn if the g7 pawn is removed. How to remove it? Well, here the answer is obvious. You should undermine it, and not with the g pawn, but with the h pawn. So if you play h6, you win. How? Your pawns are closer to the winning line. That's why, for example, doing something like that allows you a quick promotion, especially here with a check. If they decide to take, then you have a pleasant choice. You can capture on f6, or you can just push g6 and promote the g pawn faster. For example, g takes f6. This pawn is too slow. Then you promote, and this is a check. The king is unable to catch the pawn because once you capture, this is your square of a pawn. So once the king cannot get inside, you can promote safely. If the king was closer, you would, for example, continue with this move, because then this square of a pawn moves further to the right, which is further from the king. So, for example, this, and then you get your pawn promoted. So this is a very common technique that I want you to remember. When your pawns are far advanced, always remember that you can make a breakthrough. And in order to make a breakthrough, you should initiate a pawn exchange, even sacrifice a pawn, but clear the file and let your other pawn get promoted. Okay, and finally, the third strategy that I would like to share. The concept of this strategy is Zugzwang. Zugzwang occurs when any move of your opponent makes his position worse. So remember to recognize such situations, because in the pawn games they are vital. So let me explain. Here it's black to move. What I like about this position is that white always has a reserve tempo. He can always play g4. Black doesn't have such a move. They have to play with the king only, because any pawn move means a pawn blunder. For example, g6, h takes g6, and black loses. Same thing on the queen side. So here black has no other choice but to play king d7. Looks like white has to move the king or push the pawn. So moving the king back doesn't make sense. So let's push the pawn and force the enemy king to move away and let our king invade the enemy territory. For example, they can move to c7 or to e7. If the king goes to e7, then your king comes to the queen side. How? With c6. With c6, and then after they take, your king is closer to the a pawn, so you can capture it. Then, similar to our first strategy, while they play this move, you do not touch your pawn, but come closer to the enemy camp and capture his pawns. The king instead may go to c7. What should you do then? Then you invade the enemy camp as fast as possible. Of course, all that stuff should be calculated. Take en passant. He takes to not let you promote, then you take one of the pawns, and then you promote your h pawn. So this time you actually both promote simultaneously. But you take on f6 with a check, you are 2 pawns up, and this endgame is definitely winning. So in the Zugzwang scenario, your opponent is forced to play such moves that weaken his position, allowing your pawns to get promoted or allowing your king to invade the enemy camp. So to master pawn games, you need practice, knowledge, intuition, and careful calculation. Remember that seemingly simple endgames hold a lot of depth. If you enjoyed these insights and want more strategic secrets, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell to never miss an update. Until next time, keep studying, keep practicing, and I'll see you on the board.